I pray that this class will honor you, and everything that we say will bring you joy, and will also make us all even, I'll use the word deeper, Lord, followers of your Son. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we are at verse 22 in chapter 8. Verse 22 of chapter 8. And let's see. Oh, yeah, there it is. I'm going to read it all, and then I'll get going. This particular bit, though, that we're going to look at now is directly related to what we talked about last week. And so this is a very carefully constructed section of Mark. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. But we need to remember that what we talked about last week speaks directly into what we talk about this week. And it says, when they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and heal him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Then, spitting on the man's eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything now?" The man looked around. "Yes," he said, "I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around." Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and his eyes were opened. His sight was completely restored, and he could see everything clearly. And Jesus sent him away, saying, "Don't go back into the village on your way home." Okay, the episode in the boat that happened last week is it's so filled with obvious sadness on Jesus' part. It ends with a sad two-word statement. It's auto suniete. It's auto suniete, or do you not yet realize? This is the last thing that Jesus has just said. Do you not yet realize or understand? Possibly the most important aspect of this phrase is the concept of yet. Do you not yet realize, which implies that there's been ample opportunity for these men to realize, to understand, to come to belief with all of their hearts. And again, remember when we talk about their hearts, we're talking about their rational place, the rational place in their being, to realize that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the one sent by God. He is the Son of Man. All the things that we know to be true about him, by then they should have realized this, and they hadn't yet realized. And what follows in this next moment that we just read about is another opportunity for them to understand this truth about Jesus. But this next moment doesn't stand alone. It does not stand alone at all. It's actually the second half of a pair of healings. And we've already talked about the first one. Now, I talked about it, I'm sure I talked about it when I was doing the class online. But it's these two healings together. The earlier one, if you recall, where he heals a man who is deaf and has a speech impediment. And that's one of the most overwhelmingly sad healings. The state of that man is so sad to me. And yet here's the deal. These are two healings that testify to the arrival of the kingdom of God. I know of three places in the Old Testament. Now, the first one is not so strong, but I know of three places in the Old Testament where it says that when God is going to bring the kingdom about, that what's going to happen, it starts out by saying that the blind will see and the deaf will hear. And that's the first one in Psalm 146 only talks about the blind. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are weighed down. That's the first one. That's half of it. But the other two references in Isaiah 29:18 and Isaiah 35:5, man, they say, I don't know if has he got it up there? Yeah. In the day of the deaf will hear the words, who will hear words read from a book. and the blind will see through the gloom and the darkness. By the way, the reason that it says that the deaf will hear the words read from a book is because almost nobody could read. That means they're going to just hear it. And that's like whatever, 95% of the population of the world until like the 19th century were illiterate. We'll just leave it at that. But that's why it says that they will hear. And these two sections, the deaf man being brought to hearing and the blind man in this story, they work together. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. There are so many connections between those two stories, literarily and Greek-wise, that it's just like so obvious. I don't want to spoil it. I saved it for the end, which may be in 3 weeks, according to the way how many notes I have on this. But the point is this, that there's so much going on between the two that it's impossible not to see that Mark was trying to say, these work together. Now, they happened in natural life. But remember, this is Peter's retelling. He's told these stories over and over and over, and I'm sure that eventually he put them together in the way that he was talking about it, because how do we know that the Messiah has come? The deaf hear and the blind see. And these two things happened. And in fact, anytime you get, when two similar things happen in the Bible, you do what? You take note. And these two passages, which are talking about people with very different problems, maladies, if you will, but they are described in almost identical language, and the events are almost exactly the same. You have to go, wait a minute. This is two things said in the same way. And in this passage, this longer passage, if you run from the man who has a speech impediment and is deaf right through the blind man, we also have in between those, guess what we have in there? We have two miracle feedings of a multitude, which what? Have almost the same language and everything is almost the same of them. So we get not one pair of things that are the same, but we get two pairs of things that are the same, and they all tell us this: who Jesus is. And what's the big question from chapter, 4 or whenever, when they're in the boat? Who is this man? And we have just been wailed on with him with different moments when we get a chance to see who this man is. And now we are at the apex of the moment because we get a blind man. One other thing. These two healings are not in any other gospel. I'll talk about that more later. But Mark is it the prominence of Mark? Is that the word they use? Where it's like first? It's the first book written. And the others, and we'll talk about it why later when we get to the actual healing, but Peter himself, probably, because he's the star of the show in a minute, in a few weeks when we get to the next 3 verses, but he certainly had time to think about these moments. Jesus opening the ears of a deaf man should have given the disciples a clue of some way about who Jesus was. But what we'll see in this next passage is that even though they see a blind man with sight, they are not completely aware of what's going on with Jesus. Now, the passage in Isaiah says, that passage from Isaiah 35 says, this is the first, if you read this passage from verse 4 to 10 sometime, it should make you happy. Because it tells how much God is involved in our lives and what he wants to do for us. And it's just like, what great hope. And the Jews took so much hope in this. Of course, their notion of the way that the Messiah would come and the way that he would act was so different from the way that Jesus showed up that they could only attest this way, that when this man brought what? Sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf, He can't possibly be the Messiah because he's not doing what we think the Messiah ought to be doing otherwise, politically and with relationship to the law. And so the only place that power can come from is where? The devil. But anyway, this Isaiah passage, it just nails it. When he comes, he will open the eyes of the blind and unplug the ears of the deaf. And this just, how should I say? I just want to say that the similarities between what it says is going to happen and what Jesus does should have given them a clue, the disciples some clue about who he was. They're the ones that asked the questions, right? They're the ones that said, who is this guy? And so he just keeps showing them and showing them. But then, anyway, on we go. I need to stay to my notes, folks, because I'm just full of it tonight, if you will, guys. Okay. It says, when they arrived, I'm going to skip a bunch of introductory notes you can get. It says, when they arrived at Bethsaida. And I want to say there's some confusion about this location. It's difficult to pinpoint this place because Mark later calls it, oh, great, we have a map. Now, I'm just going to tell you that all maps just put Bethsaida up there. There's another one that's not on any maps except the maps that people who disagree with that one being the one where the miracle takes place. And it's down the coast a little bit between Capernaum and Magdala. And the problem is this. Bethsaida was not a village. And did you notice that he said he led him away from the village? And the word is really clear. It's a village. It's not a town, and it's a distinction. Gosh. Oh, that's in the first century. I was going to say, where'd they get that picture? Anyway, the point is this is a big town. It was a big town. And to call it a village is a mistake. And so what they're thinking is this, that, oh, by the way, that's where Peter was from. He was from Bethsaida, the town, the bigger town. Anyway, there was a small village up the lake, up the shore a bit from where the big town of Bethsaida is located, and it was razed, in other words, torn completely down by Herod Philip and rebuilt in the honor of the daughter of Caesar, and that village was called Bethsaida Julius. And, oh, by the way, Bethsaida means home of the fishermen. And this village would have been in a different part of the area. It would not have been, you see where Galanatus is? The village would have been around on the other side, where the arrow is pointing. You see where that arrow is pointing? If you just go straight up, it would have been on the other side of the Jordan, this village. And most scholars now believe that that's where this takes place. It doesn't take place in the big city of Bethsaida that's on there. And I misspoke when I told you it was down on the side by Capernaum and Magdala. It's on the west side of the Jordan, and the other village is on the east side of the Jordan. And here's the deal. The reason that most scholars believe that it was in this small village and that Mark did not misspeak, because a lot of people say, oh, he just misspoke when he wrote that it was a village. No, the reason I think it was there was because it's in a predominantly Gentile space. This is important because do you remember where the healing of the deaf man took place? It took place in Sidon, which is what? Predominantly a Gentile place. And that means that these two healings take place in a manner, in a space that show the Messiah's broader concern for all people. In fact, the way that this passage is written, we don't know if the people that bring these people to Jesus are Jewish or Gentile. And we don't know if the guys that get healed are Jewish or Gentile. In fact, this whole passage about the blind man being healed has no proper nouns in it. It's all pronouns. It doesn't say when they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus. It says to him, and he, and they, and you, and it's all that. There's nothing in it that ever names anybody. And all of this works to make it so that we're not really sure exactly where this took place, but most scholars, and I'm in agreement, think that it took place in this smaller space because Jesus was going someplace to get away from the leaders of the Jewish people. He'd just been in a big fuss with the Pharisees, and he's going someplace to get away from them in the boat. And so he would go someplace and he wanted to eventually just go someplace to rest and pray. And so he goes to a town where there are Gentiles. Makes sense to me, because it also makes sense to me because the Messiah is supposed to bring healing to whom? The nations. The nations. And the only way that he can bring healing to the nations is if he starts healing people that aren't Jewish. And so I think this is a possibility. We don't know. It's all speculative. But anyway. You should see some of the commentaries on whether or not they would have spent that much time in a boat. Would they have gone all the way over to that little village? And the map's gone. I was up there going to point it. But you can get my point. Anyway, he says, I just think that the better issue is that the Messiah has a bigger task than just the Jews. And so anyway, another thing is this, that Mark never mentions the other half of this village's name. And people go, well, that's proof that it's not that little village. Well, let me just say this. Either he didn't care about that detail, and he only gives us geographical details when it's really important. Or, how did that village get the name Bethsaida Julius? Herod came in and tore the whole place down. And he rebuilt it in honor of the Roman emperor's daughter. Now, I'm just going to say any God-fearing Jew is going to do everything he can to not bring any presence and heighten the name of some Roman emperor's daughter who had a whole bunch of people's houses torn down so they could build a new little town in honor of her. Now, let me just say, it makes sense to me that Mark and Peter would avoid calling it by that name. By the way, name changes are common. Next time when we get to when they're hiking, can you put that map back up for me, Jeff? They're going to walk up there next time we get together. That's 25 miles. And Caesarea Philippi's name changed every time there was an emperor change. I have no idea what the people called it. They probably, I don't know, a home place or something. I don't know. But it's just like names change constantly in the ancient world to honor whom? The people in political power. Anyway, I know this is a lot of stuff, but I'm just saying, it says what? It says, they arrived at Bethsaida. Picture a small village. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus. Now, we don't know who these people were. We do know that Jesus' reputation, whether they were Jewish or Gentile, had gone further enough that when Jesus shows up, these people know that they believe they can take this guy to Jesus and he can heal them. Now, there are two schools of thought about why these people, and that's exactly what it says, these people brought this man to Jesus. The first idea is very cynical. There were laws about who could beg. There were also Jewish rules about whether or not you were to give to beggars. if you passed the sniff test, as it will be, to be able to beg, which meant, in order to beg, it meant you had no ability to do anything towards the care of your own family. This guy probably was what? A beggar in Bethsaida. If it's a small village, they're tired of having a beggar, and they go, this is the cynical view now. They're saying, we're tired of having this guy on our street and us being obligated to give him something. That's the cynical view. I don't agree with it. I think these people actually cared about this man. I think it's found in the fact that the word in the Greek that is used to say what they did when they spoke to Jesus, translating it begged. Sometimes the word can be translated prayed to. It's they were calling out to him. They were imploring him. They were imploring him. And I think that is far more a sign that they were feeling for him. Later on, we're going to find out that his sight is restored, which means he was not born blind. Okay? Now, if you were born blind, that sets you up for all kinds of guilt, because either your parents had sinned somewhere and they had it all worked out what sins led to blindness and other things, or you did in the womb. You knew that. I've talked about that before in the class, but you could sin in the womb and get punished when you came out. Or, now that's a bad one. But since it says it restored his sight, people had way more understanding about people going blind because, now just think about it. I've been using reading glasses since I was in my late 30s, okay? My wife had her cataracts taken off today. This is not a possibility. Glaucoma, all the things that we have that affect our eyes happen to almost everybody. If John Milton had lived in the 20th century, he wouldn't have been a blind poet, because what was wrong with him, we could have fixed. So they had far more understanding about people going blind. Now, really religious people, really religious, legalistic people probably felt that if you went fully blind and you could see before, you were up to something that you needed punished for. Hey, by the way, this is reminding me of something. Have any of you read the book by that girl who was in the Westboro Baptist Church? Well, the guy that led that, was the boss. They're not as crazy. The book, it's called I forget the name of it. It's worth a read. It will completely shock you, because they're all brilliant. They're all lawyers. They're all college educated. They all are normal people, except for one thing, and it's that thing. But anyway, the man who started it, the guy who was recognized by the NAACP in the beginning as one of the best civil rights lawyers in America, he started this whole thing. And when he got dementia, that church voted that he had done some unknown sin and God was punishing him, and they kicked him out. That's legalism at a level I do not understand. That was still going on in that day about blindness. So, if Jesus can heal them, think about what it takes away. It doesn't just take away his lack of sight. It takes away his guilt for some kind of sin. It takes away his disconnect from the community. He can't go to the temple. It takes away the fact that he has no dignity because he earned the right to beg, probably. Now, it doesn't say that in the text, but I'm just making that assumption. In other words, these people cared about him because they knew if he gets his sight back, he doesn't just get to see things. He gets his life back. This is why they come to him and that word, that they begged him. And they ask him to do something, what? The Greek does not say and heal him. It just says to touch him. Because they know what? That in a holy man's work, the power mostly comes like this. Out your hands. And so they just want him to touch him. They don't say grab him. They don't say spit on him. They don't say do anything to him. They just say touch him. We've already seen miracles where somebody does what? They just touch the fringe of his garment and they're healed. Why? Because they believe that's the way they believed that it worked. That if a man had the power to heal, that every bit of his being carried that power, but mostly it's in the touching. Is this making sense? Am I making sense? So they come and they're begging him, please do this for him. I think because they love him. Some scholars say, nah, it's because they were just tired of giving him money. But I'm not gonna go there. They want him to touch him so he can get his sight back. And the next verse is really interesting. It says, can you put the next? This moment, he touches him, but we always see this thing as being, like in any cinematic version of it, he just sort of goes off over to those dividers over there, you know? No, he takes him by the hand. Now, picture that. This is Jesus holding hands with a blind man, all right? First off, he's a rabbi. Rabbis generally didn't want anything to do with people who were not what? Allowed to go in the temple. So he goes and he takes him by the hand. Now, this is absolutely amazing, really. It's such a tender moment. It's such a tender moment. He takes him by the hand and he leads him out of the village. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons that he could have been doing this to take him out away from people. I think that just as with the man who was deaf, this blind man had no idea what was really happening to him. I mean, they might have said Jesus is here and all this, but he couldn't see him. He couldn't see what was going on. It's just like with the deaf man, when he took him away, he wanted him to be someplace where he had a sense that it was just the two of them. Just the two of them. We all know that Jesus can heal a man of his blindness by just saying, from the next town, your friend is now healed of his blindness. Go home and you'll find that he's healed. And guess what? He could be healed because Jesus can do that. But this isn't a moment where he needs to show deep, deep compassion. And so Jesus takes him off by himself. The two of them are completely alone. Now, this brings back the point, I said it earlier. Everything that happens from here on out with this healing, only two people know about it. Okay? Jesus and the blind man. Because that's what's going on here. They are private. This is not a moment where the people are not going along with them. It's just the two of them. So all the details that we have from here on out come from one of two sources. And my bet is, guys, that this blind man did not find Peter and tell him what happened. My bet is that later on, Jesus told a few of them what happened in both of these instances. As I said, this story is not told in any other gospel. And so we don't, most of the time we get a couple of versions of everything, and so we get these details and those details and all that. But this one is just this one, and I think this comes straight out of Jesus' mouth. He probably said to Peter and James and John later, he said, well, I spit on his eyes. They're like, what? You did what? You spit in his eyes? No, they didn't. They wouldn't have said that. This is weird, though, isn't it? Can I just tell you that spit in the ancient world had exactly the same force in its sense of what it is as it does to us. They were not like enamored with being spit on, okay? They didn't think it had any kind of, like if somebody spit on them, it was ugly. That's one of the things that we're told they did to Jesus when he was being judged before he went to the cross, that they spit on him. And we're not supposed to go, oh, they're trying to show him they like him. No, as a matter of fact, it was thought to be disgusting, except in one circumstance. Because if you've been in my class, you've heard me say many times that they also felt that the bodily fluids of a healer carried the power. Their blood, their spit, their urine, their everything could heal. It carried the power. Now, some people, some scholars that I think are quite wise think that the reason Jesus spit in his eyes was to test whether or not he really wanted to be healed. Now, I'm just going to say this. I don't follow that logic. Like the blind man is just standing there and all of a sudden Jesus spits in his eyes and he's going to say, I don't want to be healed? He might say, no, you know what it said? This is what it said. Jesus was really serious about healing him because he went to the nth degree of using his bodily fluids to help bring this healing about. Does this make sense? It's a sign that he's really serious. Now, we don't believe that doctors have the power to heal generally anyway, that doctors have the knowledge of how our bodies can be healed. So we don't have that sense. You know what I mean? Like that people are able to heal. Now, there are people in the church that have the gift of healing, and I don't know that many of them are still Oh, by the way, one other thing about the spitting and taking the guy out one thing I do know is this. One of the reasons that Jesus took him away from the crowd, well, there are two reasons, actually. One is spitting on people and rubbing their spit on people was a magician's pattern. Magic men spit on people and rub their spit on them. Jesus did not want his actions to be equated with magicians. And here's the other thing. What he did not want to do was make spitting in people's eyes or spitting on his fingers. Because remember with the deaf man, he spit on his fingers and then he stuck them in his ears. He did not want to give the broader population a template on how you go about healing people. If the whole crowd had been there and Jesus was standing there and he goes, well, Charlie and Joe are going to go home and go, if I have enough faith and I do that, Jesus did it. There must be something in the pattern of spitting that if I do it, it'll work. A template, right? Fortunately, Jesus only spit on one guy one time. I'm glad he didn't do it every time because, man, can you imagine? I've been to healing services. I'm all about the fact that God can heal miraculously, but I'm just glad that it's almost exclusively done with anointing with oil and the laying on of hands. I'm just glad we haven't gotten into the spitting part. Anyway, we'll just leave it at that. He spits in the guy's eyes, and then he lays his hands on him. The laying on of hands is to bring about the full power that he has. And then he does something that he never does anywhere else. This is the only place that it happens. Jesus asks the person he's trying to heal, can you see anything? Now, you want to talk about scholarly debate. There are so many things that people say about this. It goes everything from the reason that Jesus did this, he asks him the question, is because he already knows that he can't see anything clearly. And what he's trying to do is to do an enacted prophecy to let the disciples know that their vision is cloudy and it needs to be cleared up more, about who he is. Now, I'm just going to say that's nice to think about on the backside, but in the moment, I have no idea what was going on. Possibly Jesus knew that the recreation of this man's eyes was going to take some big work on God's part, and so he was going to go after it. But it doesn't make any sense to me because he's healed a lot of people from a distance. So I just do not know. Can we just say sometimes Jesus can do things that we can't figure out? Is it okay that we say that? But he says, he lays his hands on him and he asks him a question. He never asks anybody. Have you ever noticed how he never asks anybody that question? He goes, can you get up? No, he says, get up. Or he doesn't say, are you feeling better? And he goes, where'd that power go? And I know you're, what? He never responds with a question, but here he does. Can you see anything now? What happens? There's an interesting, strange detail in the response. If you notice, it says, the man looked around. That's okay. It literally says he looked up. And I've been thinking about that. It's like, it's either out of a position of humility that he looks up, or that he is looking up, like I don't know what position he's in when Jesus spits on him and does all this. I don't know. But he looks around and he's close enough to people to be able to see them, but it's not like they're not nearby. And he says, I see people. This is one of those very dynamic translations of the NLT. He says, I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around. The passage itself in the Greek is really difficult to translate in any way that makes sense in English. But that's really good. That's a really good way to say it. I keep pointing up there because I'm seeing it up there, by the way. This is a really good way to see it. Say it. It gets the idea. What this means is that this is also a clue to the fact that he used to be able to see, because he knows what people look like and he knows what trees look like. Now, some guys, scholars, and I say guys because all the ones that say this are guys, but they say, well, he's had enough interaction as a blind man, if he's been blind all his life, with trees and people, that he at least can recognize them now that he's seeing them. Well, I'm unsure about that. He's saying, I see people that look like they're trees walking around, their arms. And one scholar just went crazy over the fact that we call this part of our bodies our trunks. And that was proof that he was confused between the two trunks. Well, that doesn't work in any language in the ancient Middle East. We'll just leave it at that. They did not call themselves by that word at all. But anyway, the point is this, that he could see, but he couldn't see distinctly. And he knew the difference. Probably the greatest Greek scholar of the last century is named Dr. Cranfield. And if you have a book by him on any book of the Bible, all it is Greek and then very technical things about that word or that phrase in the Greek. And it's parsed out, and he gives you these definitions, and he's very dry, and I find it absolutely wonderful. If I could tattoo it to my wrist, or I'd be like a quarterback when I preach, with those things that they wear. Cranfield's notes. Anyway, the point being, he says that when you read this Greek sentence, it is formed, and I have no idea how he knows this, but he said it is formed in a way to bring out great excitement. That the way you read it, I naturally would read it, yes, but I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around. I don't even know how to say that and be whoopee, fired up. But that's what he says we should do when we translate this. Somehow we need multiple exclamation points. This is a blind man who suddenly can see something. That's a big difference. When I get up in the morning every day, I go down into our kitchen, and it's as dark as a dungeon in our kitchen in the morning when I get up at 5 o'clock. And there's a little light, a little night light that's off to the side that responds to my presence. And I know if I walked like right straight to our counter and I go like this, that little light will come on. Now, I can't see very much in the room. I can't read the paper. I can't see to make myself a cup of tea. I can't do anything. But the room changes from being pitch dark so that I don't walk into anything. Get my point? The difference between the dark room and just that little light makes me feel completely different about everything. Now, let's blow that up to a man who is completely and totally blind. And suddenly, he can tell there are people over there. They look kind of like trees, but he can see them. And guess what? His world has changed. I'm just saying. And this is not like a failure on Jesus' part. I think this is slowly working him into the fullness of what he's got coming so that it doesn't overwhelm him. Why would Jesus do this? Because he has great compassion for every individual, and so he wants to do what is absolutely necessary for them. Do you remember back when we were with you probably don't. I don't know how many of you watched those videos. I stopped looking at the numbers because one week 600 people would watch the videos of my teaching, and the next week 6 would. I don't understand it, but that's just what happened. And when we did the guy who was deaf and had the speech impediment, and Jesus took him off to the side and said, you need to don't go out and just start telling everybody about this. Don't tell them about this. Why? Now, the guy went out and told everybody about it. Why? Because he could talk for the first time in his life. But why did Jesus take him away off to the side and say, don't talk to people about it? Because he knew that the best thing for this guy was for him not to make a big show of all this, like it's some sort of magic act thing, because now he's going to be what? He's going to be that guy that used to have this, and now he has this, and everybody, and then all the people go, he used to talk like this, and now he talks like this, and he knew that's not what he needed. It's not what he needed. He didn't do what Jesus said, but this guy needs to come in slowly, and it needs to be with Jesus as the only person there seeing it. Okay? Can you put the next verse up for me, Jeff? It says, then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again. Some people say that, I said this earlier, is an enacted prophecy. That means that the prophet acts out some of the truth that some other people need to learn. And so what's happened here is that Jesus first, he clears it up a little bit, but it's still fuzzy. So the man goes from knowing nothing to knowing a little bit about what's going on, to then being completely healed, and he sees everything. And that's really not about the blind man. It's about the disciples, because they came to Jesus and they were completely blind about everything. And then they've been with him for a while, and right now they're getting a little bit, they got a little bit of clarity about who he is. Later on, after the resurrection, they're going to see everything clearly, and they're going to be able to just know exactly what's going on. And so Jesus is just doing this so they have a picture of what's actually happening to them. Now, again, I don't think that that's what Jesus was thinking at all. I think that Peter thought about it later. It works. It works as an image. I mean, yeah, it works, but we're talking about a real man here. A real man who is really blind. And Jesus is actually, I think the reason that Mark, having heard Peter talk about it so much, stuck these all together in a space where we're very clear on the fact that the disciples they don't have any idea who Jesus is yet. They're really confused. They can see him and they see what he's doing, but they can't see it clearly. And then what do we get next week? We get Peter saying that he's the Christ. I think we may get to it. We may get to it next week. But the point being, this is all interesting. I like to keep these things at a level for real people who are living in the real world, because that's where we want Jesus to be involved in our lives. I don't want to get to heaven and find out that Jesus says to me, I got to tell you something, Tim. You know that time you got hit by that van and they broke all your ribs and knocked you crazy, and the guy drove off and you ripped half the skin off your face, and you had to get up and teach the elders about egalitarian and complementarian positions of the church, and you don't remember it because you were knocked out? Well, that didn't happen. It's okay that it happened to you, but it was really to teach some other people a story about how you come to truth. So I'm sorry you had to break your ribs, and I'm sorry, you know what I'm saying? I don't want him to say that to me when I get to heaven. If he says that, that's fine. But that just doesn't seem to be the case. It seems more like he spared me from being run over by a great big truck and saved me from dying is what was important, because he cares about me, and he wanted me to stay on doing what I'm doing for a while longer. It wasn't time for me to come home. Does this make sense? I hope it makes sense. I think about this stuff all the time. He can see clearly. Now, the two words that go together, and actually, Jeff, I don't want you to put that up because I did a lot more research on it after I gave you the notes. And so what I gave you was partial. So we don't need to put that up. But literally, the two words say to see clearly, but the word that is translated clearly, in its rawest literal form means to see something in a far shinier manner. A far shinier manner. They didn't have glasses and 20/20 vision. This word, though, would say that his vision from a long distance, he could see them in a far shinier manner than he could ever have imagined. And the things up close, he could see in a far shinier manner than he could ever imagine. This guy's eyesight was as good as God created us to be able to see. Now, oddly, nobody says anything about it. Now, I'm just betting. Listen to Tim's bet. When Jesus went back to the disciples and was talking about it to them, he told them what he said about not being able to see clearly. Whatever he said after he could see everything perfectly, I'm betting it was wild and woolly and excited beyond imagination. And Jesus didn't want to bore him with the details. He just didn't want to. He said, yeah, he could see clearly. He didn't want to say to him, and he said this to me, and he said this to me, and he said this, because that's not important to Jesus. The only thing that's important to Jesus is that he could see and that they knew that he'd healed them. So we don't get anything from the guy. And we don't get anything from Jesus about it either. He doesn't ask him another question. He goes, how clear can you see that? He doesn't say that. Or he says, yeah, can you tell now that those are trees and not people? He doesn't say anything like that. But it does say one thing. Jesus sent him away saying, he says, don't go back into the village. He says, go back to your home. A couple of things. Why would Jesus do this? Well, first off, here's the first reason Jesus would do that. Say, don't go back to the village. He's saying, don't go back with the people that brought you out. Don't tell them about this. You go back home. There's a whole bunch about this. I've got a few minutes. Okay, can I finish this up? If the blind man had gone back into the village immediately and going, I can see everything, and they said, how did that happen? And he says, Jesus spit in my eyes. And then he touched me. There's plenty of, and I have them in the notes, references of other people in the history of that time who used their spit to bring blindness to blind people. There are stories of this. And they all are called magicians. If Jesus, the announcement into the village of the fact that this Jesus had just given him sight by spitting in his eyes, the emphasis would have been on the process and not the person who brought the healing. Then everybody would have lumped Jesus in with known magicians who used their body fluids to bring about healings. And so that's the first reason Jesus doesn't want him to go in, because he doesn't want him to go back in there and then have everything suddenly blow up about the fact that Jesus is just like local magic people. Jesus doesn't need that. Secondly, it says, it says, don't go back into the village on your way home. It's really more like, do not go to the village, go home kind of language more. The word is the word that sometimes it's translated home and sometimes it's translated house. It's very clear that it's his house, his home, which means he had a place called home that wasn't in the village, that was someplace else. Now, if he lost his sight over time and his sight was restored, he could have been old enough to have a wife and children. Or if he'd lost his sight before he was ever able to be married, he could be living with siblings or his parents or someone like that. And who are the first people that deserve to find out that this man can see? It's not the villagers, it's his family, because his family's been paying the price for him being a blind man all this time. His family is, if he's a begging man in the village, can you imagine if the job of one of your family members, possibly your husband or your father, is that he has to go into town every day and beg because he's lost his sight, and that's how you survive? Think about it. The first people that need to have a joyous moment are his family members. And Jesus says, don't go into the village. Go home. Be with them first. Celebrate with them first. Everybody's going to find out eventually anyway when you don't go to work on Monday. You get it? This is what's happening. It's a really powerful moment. And Jesus is doing what? He's being very, very clear about who's the most important person in this whole thing. That man is. Now, I just want to say that this is part of what people refer to as the Messianic Secret. And in the book of Mark in particular, there are a lot of places where Jesus says, don't tell anybody about this. Don't go talking about that. Don't go in the village, go home. And so that what they've built, and to be perfectly honest, it's a 19th century thing. Nobody thought about this it was out there, but it's like people were wondering about it. But the Messianic Secret became the way that people read the whole book of Mark. And like it's this big thing. I just read N.T. Wright today, and he said that the Messianic Secret, as a theory about the main things that are happening in Mark has outlived its past date due. Or due date, past, or sell by, that's what it was. It's outlived its sell by date. And here's why. I think if you look at each individual time when Jesus says, don't do that, or don't say this, there is some practical reason on the ground that he would do that makes perfect sense in the moment. It's not like he has some grand plan in the back of his mind to keep a secret from people, and that he's working the system all the time to do this. Now, that's what people come to that decision, and that's okay, but it sort of changes everything because it makes it Jesus is trying to keep people from knowing he's the Messiah, when it seems to me that the whole point of the book of Mark is to tell you that he is the Messiah. Now, there are some times when he says, well, don't tell him. He's going to say that. He's going to say that when the disciples say you're the Messiah, when Peter says that, and he's going to say, don't say that. Don't tell anybody. But they're in a Gentile area where it's a Roman town. You don't tell people the Messiah has shown up in a Roman town because the Romans hear the word Messiah and they just kill them. Okay, it makes sense that he would say, keep it to yourself for a while, guys. We don't need me to be killed today by the Romans just because they don't want to have a Messiah who's going to come and rebel against us. I'm just saying, every time we get to one of those places, you can figure it out. And in this case, I think we can figure out why he says just go home. He doesn't say don't tell anybody. He doesn't say keep it a secret. He says just don't go in the village first. Go home. Go back to your family. Go back to your family. I think that's powerful. And the reason it is powerful is it's because it shows me the deep compassion of Jesus in each moment. He's not manipulating the circumstances because he has a big plan. He's changing what he tells people to do based on what he knows is important in the moment for them. And Peter just happened to remember all these times that Jesus said, don't say anything. Does this make sense? Now, I have a ton of stuff that I'd like to tell you next week about how I promised you this, and I could just see the joy in your eyes when I brought it. That the first passage on the man who's deaf and the second passage on the man who's blind, I said there are all kinds of literary and linguistic commonalities, and I wrote down pages of them, and you are going to hear them, whether you like it or not. But I think we'll start there next week. Is that okay? Because I think I've worn you out. I mean, I've really worn you out tonight. But here's the deal. Can I just say one thing about this? And then we'll go. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke do not carry this story. I think the reason is that Matthew didn't see it, and I don't think that Jesus told him about it. I think he just told Peter, James, and John like he did everything else. Now, I could be wrong on that. When I get to heaven and Matthew will go, how dare you say that? But I think that it was like secondhand news to him, and it had this magic stuff in it, because the truth is, some of the spitting and the hands and stuff is magician stuff from that period of time. And so Matthew's like, I don't need to tell any Jew, because remember, Matthew wrote his gospel to the Jewish people. And he's thinking, I just don't need to go any place where Jesus is acting like a magician, because that's just going to change the story. Okay? I think that's with Matthew. Luke, I don't think he could find any. Peter was not a source for Luke's gospel. I don't think he found anybody that could corroborate the story. And so there's no point in him putting in his gospel. And they'd already read Mark's, and that was in there, and they knew that Peter saw it, heard about it from Jesus, probably, and that they had done something masterful in the creation of the gospel so that it worked to tell two stories. One about what happened to real people, and then how they came to faith, and it all works in a literary sense. And so they left it out, because Mark's remembrances of Peter's preaching was so good. And the reason that Peter couldn't leave it out, or that Mark couldn't leave it out, was this. What we're going to see really soon is that Peter's going to figure out who Jesus is, and he's going to declare that Jesus is the Messiah. And that's good news. It changed Peter's life. Those two stories worked to get him to realize who Jesus was. And then when he saw him going to the cross, he figured it all out. And it was now what? The good news. And if those two stories could change Peter's life, then they can still change anybody's life. And it's still good news. It still tells us who Jesus is. And it tells us clearly that he's the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man. I think that's cool. That it's still gospel. Okay? All righty, I'll see you next week, guys. We'll start right there. Thanks.